What happens when ancient ecosystems clash with modern ideology? What if the decision to reintroduce apex predators into the wild isn't as wild as it sounds? Or maybe it's wilder than we ever imagined. Welcome back to the Primitive Republic podcast, powered by Wrangled Media, where we challenge assumptions, explore untamed truths, and reconnect with the roots of human endurance, resilience, and responsibility. I'm your host, Aaron Schmaus. Today, we're diving into one of the most controversial wildlife decisions in North America, the reintroductions of wolves into Colorado. But this story doesn't start in the Rockies. It stretches far north to the dense forests of British Columbia and even deeper into the history of North America's Indigenous people. My guest today, Mark Hall of Blood Origins Canada, a conservationist, storyteller, and one of the most grounded voices in the wild world of predator management. Together, we'll talk about wolves, grizzlies, caribou, culture, and conflict. This isn't just about wildlife. It's about history, it's about politics, and it's about asking hard questions like, who really lives with the consequences of conservation? So buckle up. This episode might just challenge the way you see the wild. But first, a message from our sponsors. This episode of the Primitive Republic podcast is brought to you by 6am Outdoors. Ultralight gear built to go the distance. Whether you're chasing bugles in the backcountry or grinding out miles on a solo trek, 6am keeps your pack light and your mind focused. And with a lifetime guarantee, you're not just saving weight, you're saving money. Rugged, reliable, and ready, gear up at 6amoutdoors.com. That's www.viamoutdoors.com. Remember, adventure begins at 6 a.m. Ready to level up your backcountry game? The Big Game Academy is where serious hunters go to get even deadlier. Sharpen or even begin your long-range skills education with distances over 1,000 yards. Learn to navigate without a GPS and master elk calling, game breakdown, gear selection, and much more from skilled professionals and military veterans. All under the wide open skies of the Kia Grande Ranch in Pagosa Springs, Colorado. 4 days, endless skills. Sign up at huntskills.com and get ready to hunt with purpose. This episode is also brought to you by Invader Concepts, the Montana-made holster company that don't mess around. Built by hand, battle-tested, and backed by a no BS lifetime guarantee. These rigs are purpose-built for backcountry hunters and everyday carriers alike. I trust their Recon chest rig on every wilderness trip. And their Outlaw and standard in the waist belt and out of the waist belt holsters keep me locked and loaded day to day. Quiet Ride Tech means all-day comfort, no clatter. These are the last holsters that you will ever need to buy. Head over to Invader Concepts and use promo code TPR to knock 10% off of your order. So why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself? I don't know if I did you quite justice. It's been quite a while and that I've been wanting to interview somebody from Blood Origins. So.
Well, it's an honor, Aaron, to be on your show, and this conversation spans 2 countries, so it's an honor to be part of it. So, I am the host of the Hunter Conservationist podcast in British Columbia, and I'm also the director and co-founder of Blood Origins Canada, which was the first global expansion of the Blood Origins brand developed by Robbie Kroger. So
Nice. Yeah,
that's me.
I've met Robbie a couple times. Seems like a great guy, and
love working with him. With him.
And Jamie Nash, his friends with him and stuff like that, and he always told me to every time I see him, give him crap. And I can't remember now.
I just mailed James a spear fishing bumper sticker that somebody sent me from Australia. So
nice.
It was like, I know who I should send this to. So.
Yeah. Yeah. He's always telling me to give Robbie crap about the All Blacks. So Yeah, let's go ahead and start. So I've got kind of a what's unique for me is the way my podcast has always gone before is, it's just kind of an avant-garde thing. But I think I'm going to transition it more into, a structured sort of thing. And with this situation, I think it's best if we just kind of start at the beginning. Um, so what when it comes to predators and stuff like that, one of the biggest things with that we encounter, I think, when we're looking at reintroducing predators or managing predators and stuff like that, is the indigenous peoples side of the argument. Um, they had great regard for really all animals, and predators. It seems that most of the indigenous peoples knew that predators needed to be managed, even though they had high reverence for them. So, what do you know? First off, what do you know about the number of indigenous people in North America, like pre-European contact? And I'll lead us somewhere with this, but how many people do you think lived in North America pre-European contact?
So that's as the way I understand it, that has been an evolving area of science or anthropology for quite a number of decades. And I mean, just to kind of put it into context, years and years ago, I was an instructor in an Indigenous natural resource management program in the community I live in British Columbia. It was sort of a college program. There were Indigenous students, and it was about picking up the skills to so that they're employable in like forestry and fisheries and wildlife management. And one of the students in my class was from the community I live in, which is the traditional territory of the Ktunaxa people in southern British Columbia. They're super interesting people because their language is known as a language isolate. They're the only people in all of North America with that language structure. They are not related to any of the other like 5 major language groups on the continent. So he told me when he was young that in school he was told by schools in like the white school system that the state of knowledge was that his people were only in this area for 200 years prior to the Europeans first arriving here in the Rocky Mountains of southern British Columbia. In his lifetime and my lifetime, archaeologists that started doing more work actually placed the Ktunaxa people in British Columbia when the glaciers were still covering the continent. They were traveling across the glaciers and hitting the tips and tops of the Rocky Mountains and the Purcell Mountain Range. So pushing over 10,000 years ago. So, that's an example of time on the landscape. And to your question, like the reason I told that story is because in how short a time in our lifetime, our understanding of Indigenous peoples on North America has really radically changed. I know, you know, early on when I was a kid, papers or even as a young adult, they were placing the numbers of people in the hundreds of thousands in North America at the time of contact. More research is being uncovered that is putting it in the tens, possibly hundreds of millions of people. There's that sort of science is being expanded into South America, where they're now thinking that there were such large cities and numbers of people like in the Amazon that they were actually like clearing forest and changing the ecosystems, because the Amazon rainforest that we see today, scientists have said the only way this forest could be here today is if it had been cleared and started from bare ground, because they just look at the different types of tree species and how they react to being in canopies. And through modern archaeology work and stuff, they're finding these structures and these agriculture areas, and they're just it's changing science is changing the hypothesis. And I think it's going to depend on the time period. During Wisconsin glaciation, half the continent was pretty much inhabitable, versus, after the glaciers receded and stuff. But I think bottom line is, I think where science is at now is it was a much more populated continent, and economies, transportation, goods and people and stuff traveling from one end of the continent, to the other. They find stuff in the deserts of New Mexico that came from quarries in the Rocky Mountains of Canada and stuff. Like it's pretty massive, and that would take a lot of people, to make that happen.
Sure, absolutely. So I bring that up because I want to kind of contrast that to the number of people that we have in North America now, right? Last I checked, it was over 500 million people in
Mm.
North America. And now that's through Central America and, into Canada and Alaska and all that, right? Um, you know, the most that I've seen with the number of people, pre-colonialization has been about 120 million, you know, and so the reason I bring that up is because of this huge problem that we have right now called urban sprawl. And and that's, as hunters and outdoorsmen and stuff like that, and those, pre recording, you and I were kind of talking about a segue into urban sprawl and management and all that kind of stuff. And that's one of the things that's going to play a huge point, I think, in this conversation. Where do we go with talking about management of animal species, and how does that play into the quote unquote coexist uh, mentality of management or lack thereof, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
exactly.
so what are you're in a situation where you get to work closely with First Nations and Indigenous um, up there, correct? Or am I wrong
Yeah,
on
I
that?
mean, over my lifetime and different, things that I've done in my career, being involved with Indigenous people, partnering on projects. The college program that I worked in was fairly unique, but yeah, there's a close relationship there with either, you know co co-working together on projects, or I've had the luxury of a tremendous amount of my projects, that I used to work on in the field of natural resource management. You would reach a point where you got to bring archaeologists in, to then kind of confirm presence absence of archaeological sites on the landscape. So I've learned a tremendous amount, especially in my area in the southeastern part of the province, about land and resource use patterns of people, over the last 8 to 10,000 years. I mean, gosh, I remember one time I was in the way up high in the Rocky Mountains on a mining exploration project, and an archaeologist found a stone artifact that was basically laying at surface up in the Alpine. He knew the lithics, he knew what it was, he kind of potentially knew where it came from and the time frame, and he said it's about probably pushing about 8,000 years old, and it's the first known confirmation of Indigenous people in that entire valley in the
Wow.
southeastern corner of the province. So it's been a big part of my learning journey, as and even podcasting. I've had Indigenous people on the podcast, and learned a lot about different areas of the province. Especially a couple of times we've had the former president of the Tahltan central government from northern BC. Their traditional territory covers about 11% of the entire province of British Columbia. And some great conversations learning about Tahltan people and the Tahltan bear dog and their relationship and actually their style of predator management. They're a very strong nation that was actively involved in predator management, and they had a very different way of approaching predator management, but they actually did do it. And it seems like every nation that I've came across in some way, shape, or form, uh, they acknowledge the fact that predator management was a part of their way of life. If they were on the coast, sea otters and pinnipeds. If they're in the interior, it was wolves and grizzly bears.
So that's actually a perfect segue. So how do we, um, how did the Indigenous, from all of your experience in speaking with them and stuff like that, how did they manage predator species?
Well, the one that the story that was shared with me by Chad Norman Day from the Tahltan Nation in northern BC was, and he's a bit younger than me, super smart guy, really a go-getter, and he became president of his nation at actually quite a young age until he retired this last fall. So what he said their nation used to do was, whenever they sensed that the wolf population was getting too high and they were starting to see impacts to their food resources, which was moose and caribou, they also relied on salmon runs on the Stikine River system the Stikine empties into the Pacific by Wrangell, Alaska. But they were just so abundant that the bears were there. They're like, there's no need, there's enough for everybody. So they were never worried about salmon bears. But when they moved into the plateaus, yeah, the wolves and grizzly bears could reach a point where they're like, okay, things are getting a little out of control here. When it comes to wolves, they used to manage wolf density on the landscape wolf competition by managing the numbers of pups at the den.
Hmm.
They believed that the adult male and the adult female should stay intact because they played a role in the ecosystem. But based on their understanding of what level the wolf control was needed, they would find the dens and they would lethally remove pups. 1 out of
Wow.
5, 2 out of 5, 4 out of 5, like something like that, based on the level of management that was needed. So, yeah, I remember, I never forget it. This was years ago, but he was like, "This is going to be a little hard for you folks in the big city to hear, but this is how my people used to do it because they believed in leaving the breeding pair alone."
Yeah. So I'm guessing that they had to kind of learn that over time, how maybe if it was two pups that they removed versus, one pup, how that
It
would affect things.
That was very much the way it so just living on the land, being on the land, they're in tune with the cycles, over a period of time. They're seeing certain impacts to moose population or caribou, observing more wolves. They could calibrate where they were in that cycle, predator prey dynamics, and they knew when they had to intervene with management. And so it was either like they were either at a part of the cycle where it was like, okay, it's just we can see some changes over the last whatever years, a little bit of removal, or things have really got out of control in this valley and we really need to go to like a heavy removal to try to balance things out a little bit. So yeah, I mean, it was just, as you know from being a hunter on the landscape, that the more time you spend out there and in contact, you get in tune with the rhythm of how nature's operating, where the cycles are, and how to insert yourself into that. And they could do that collectively as a group of people and make those decisions on, you know they also were a heavy bear hunting nation, especially grizzly bears. And the Tahltan people actually had a breed of dog which they had prior to European contact called the Tahltan bear dog. And they were used to put bears, primarily grizzly bears, at bay, so that they could be killed when the hunters arrived there. The tall tan bear dog was a unique species of canine, and during the impacts of colonization, that the social structures and the dynamics of communities in the Tall Tan Nation were so disrupted, the people were so broken up that people just stopped caring for the dogs, and eventually nobody was paying attention, and the line of dogs actually went extinct.
I thought I had read something somewhere that, or maybe I heard it somewhere that um, that there is no longer that line of bear dog anymore.
Yep. Yep. They're completely gone. So, yeah, I mean, you hear stories surface or
Sure,
whatever, where somebody's like, we've
they
managed to
spotted one
resurrect or
somewhere.
find the,
Yeah,
the tall tan bear dog, and you can buy the pups and they're $2,500 a piece or whatever. And it's like, no, the people that knew, they said our dog is gone.
yeah. So,
So,
did they have the same sort of um, ideology when it came to managing prey species, like the herbivores and stuff like that, where maybe they would kind of disperse it, where maybe they'd take more deer this year because they seem to be hurting, or more caribou one year, or did they manage it that way? Or
I can't say for sure, because our conversation didn't really get to that side of how they used to interact with their sustenance harvesting. So, I would have to presume, that they would move around on the landscape in different areas. I mean, I see this even today with modern peoples in First Nations communities. They talk about, like, we'll go into an area, we think we'll be okay if we removed 6 caribou out of this area, but then we're going to leave it for 2 years.
hmm.
and
So,
and, and that's still part of cultures even way into eastern Canada and stuff. I've heard those types of things, so I think that goes back
yeah.
generations upon generations.
Well, one of the other thing that I've heard as a talking point in several podcasts, several interviews, I think I've read it in certain books and papers and stuff like that, is that a lot of Indigenous, and I don't know if the First Nations were this way, but they used to manage the forests as well. Um, did the First Nations and some of the northern tribes, did they manage the forests, do prescribed burns or anything like that that you know of?
I i don't know if cultural burning was as important to nations that lived in the north. So I know it was in the southern part of the province where I live. So drier habitats like the Douglas fir, ponderosa pine, ecosystems that are more typical of Montana and Idaho, and the drier parts of the Rocky Mountains. Even the Spokane Valley. That sort of same more arid sagebrushy type country and stuff that moves into British Columbia, into the Okanagan region. Those were areas where cultural burning was definitely part of, even the modern, you know, understanding of what their people used to do historically. And it kind of made sense because that's, where fire was more frequent
Hmm.
on the landscape. The north is just so fundamentally vast, and and large, and even the density of animals is, you got to cover a lot of ground to find them. So I'm not exactly sure, if cultural burning was as important to northern peoples. Coastal people, they originally thought maybe it wasn't so much because they lived in an ecosystem where fire wasn't a dominant factor. But they actually have found, again, through archaeology, in coastal digs and stuff, like uh, evidence possibly that they were burning coastal forests, as late as 8,000 years ago. So,
Hmm.
there's benefits even in the coast of under burning old growth cedar hemlock forest, because you get things like red huckleberry will rejuvenate, and of course that's a food source. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, I mean,
Well,
it's it's pretty varied. I mean, the caveat I always have on these conversations, at least in Canada, there's over 600 distinct nations in Canada, and there's over 200 in just the province of British Columbia where I live, like distinct nations of Indigenous peoples, and their culture, their language, their geography, their history, their way of life. Every single one is different, and it is sort of complex to talk in high level, sort of generic things. So that's why whenever I sort of have an example, it's like a specific nation and a specific person I talk to, and generalities are kind of hard to.
Sure. Yeah. Well, and I bring that up as well because, you know, one of the things, and it might have been one of the podcasts that you did, um, it talks about the issues with caribou and stuff like that. And we used to have caribou actually in Montana, and now I think it's pretty well gone. Um,
Yeah, and
and
and in northern Idaho, the last of the southern mountain caribou herds in Idaho were actually captured and translocated to a maternal penning facility in southern BC to try to save the species by rearing the offspring in captivity. But yeah,
yeah,
I've got like a bull caribou antler sitting over here where I found not too far from the Montana border in British
wow,
Columbia in the Flathead Valley. And I finally ended up tracing it down to people that said, yeah, they used to be in the northern Flathead Valley of Montana.
yep,
So what you probably found was a bull that was coming or going, migrating through an area that people didn't really know that they were in BC, but it was probably en route somewhere in the late winter or late fall, early winter, late fall, and pitched its antler off on its way maybe into the Purcell Mountain range of central BC.
right. So, what has affected the northern caribou herds? Um, because I believe from what I've heard is that the the forests, and I might have this wrong, so correct me if I'm wrong, but the forests have gotten really thick or something like that because they're not being grazed as much anymore, or um,
Well, when it specifically comes to caribou in Alberta and British Columbia, we have the mountain caribou, and then we have like subgroups or ecotypes of the mountain caribou. So there's the northern groups, which are in northern northwestern British Columbia and up into the Yukon, and they're the big horns, the classic mountain caribou that everybody pictures with the big white mane, like big impressive antlers, but like in the open steppe tundra type country. Those herds are generally kind of doing okay. The different herds in different areas, some are up, some are stable, some are increasing. Generally, those herds are okay in the northwestern part of British Columbia. They're still huntable. Then, as you come east and south, they have what's called the southern mountain caribou herd, still a mountain caribou, but they're adapted to living in old growth forests, high elevation old growth forests, old growth cedar hemlock forests. And they relied heavily on those forests, very different habitats. They are an endangered species in the province. They're not hunted anymore.
wow,
And then there's a third group that's farther north, in the northeastern part of British Columbia, northwestern part of Alberta, called the boreal subgroup, and they kind of live more in like the scrubby boreal forest region of the boreal forests, and they're also endangered. And it's habitat impact driven. The old growth forests, which came all the way down into the Cascade areas of Idaho, and they were targeted for logging. Old growth forests, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. That's where all your old timber is, your big timber, heavily logged. A lot of the habitat was then, as it started to regenerate, favored moose.
hmm.
And so the moose population started to explode. The caribou started to get pressed into smaller and smaller areas with moose or where I live, it happened to be the explosion of white-tailed deer as well. And they like the logged areas, they do well in it. Then came the predators. The access was there, more abundant game, more predictable to find moose and whitetails. So the wolf populations exploded. Then you got caribou that were on the decline because their habitat was declining. Moose and white-tailed deer are increasing. The wolves are increasing with that food base. And then all of a sudden the wolves are like, oh, hey, look, a caribou. They go and kill it. Well, that's now the herd went from 20 to 19, and so they had a disproportionate impact on the caribou that was triggered by this habitat impact thing. In some of the southern mountain caribou management zones, they figure that the density of wolves is 2 to 3 times what it was historic and what the caribou were adapted to. So moose evolved to deal with high densities of wolves. They're big, they're powerful, they're long legs. They stomp holes in them. Caribou, their strategy, because they're smaller, their strategies was just to be like hard to find. And caribou lived in either the old growth forests or in the north. They actually separated from moose by living in very, very poor nutrient ecosystems, and they learned to live off less nutrients than a moose. So they were less susceptible. The wolves had to work harder to find them, either in the old growth forests or in the steppe tundra areas. And the wolves tended to stick to the moose. But when we came along, we changed this whole ecosystem, increased the density of wolves to an unnatural level, meaning unnatural. The caribou had no evolutionary mechanisms to deal with wolves that were 7, 8, 9, 10 wolves per 1,000 square kilometers, rather than 1, 2, or 3 wolves per 1,000 square kilometers. And consequently, they just were getting hammered by
Yeah.
predation.
So did grizzlies play a factor in that as well, or?
They think that they do, especially more in the calving seasons. Being
Yeah, that's one of the
areas where they're
big things here with elk is they love elk calves.
yeah, and again, grizzly bears, they're one of the species that generally benefit from disturbance on the landscape, benefit from fires, they benefit from logging, because we tend to create, through either of those two disturbances, create the type of plant communities like herbs, grasses, forbs, and berry crops that didn't exist in the mature forests. So grizzly bears generally do better in early seral habitats. So I don't know for sure, but I would assume their numbers probably expanded a bit with industrial logging in parts of the southern caribou's habitat, and they probably did play a role. But most of the science I've seen in British Columbia anyways, and Alberta, is the wolves are the dominant factor that's impacting the recovery of the endangered southern herds.
So what is the BC government doing about the predation issue that's hammering the caribou?
So the endangered southern mountain caribou herds are broken up into their distinct herds, just literally like polygons, all the way from where I live into the northeastern corner of the province. And each herd has a different set of dynamics that's affecting them. The herds whose recovery or growth are limited by high rates of wolf predation, those management zones, those caribou recovery areas, are the ones that the provincial government has an annual aerial wolf control program on. They're shooting wolves out of the helicopters. Generally, their target is in a geographic area to remove 80% of the wolf population in a geographic area every winter.
Wow. And so do you guys have the same problems up there with the general population, the urban population getting up in arms about
Oh
uh,
yeah,
those
yeah,
issues?
yeah. No, it's a big thing. There's people make their living off of Save the Wolf campaign, right? So they basically paint the picture that the government is making the wolf a scapegoat, and it's actually like logging that's the problem, not predation. So, but in order to keep industrial logging going, they make the wolf a scapegoat, and then they're killing the wolves in order so that logging can continue. And that's kind of the narrative that's painted, just this unnecessary, killing of wolves. And they have the whole thing where they go, did you know since 1998 to now the government has killed X number of thousands of wolves? Like, that's matters. Like, it's a year to year thing that matters. But they never tell the story of the caribou. When they're challenged with that, they always revert back to how this whole thing started, which was unsustainable rates of logging the caribou's old growth habitat. Yes, that's what started it, but it's not the habitat that's limiting the recovery of the caribou. It's too much predation. So yes, you can stop logging. Yes, you can set areas aside. Yes, you can let areas recover, but they're not going to be in a condition that the caribou is going to benefit from for hundreds of years. The thing that's going to make them disappear off the landscape is unsustainable rates of predation. So that's where the focus is right now, is on predator control, buying time for habitat recovery, habitat restoration work on seismic lines in the oil and gas sector in the northern part of the province. They're experimenting with, deactivating and restoring seismic lines, which is, giving wolves access to hunt areas more efficiently and whatnot. So that happens.
So
They are
what is the seismic lines? I'm not familiar. Are you talking about
so
the
in
cut lines
Yeah,
for?
the cut lines. So
Okay,
it's how they do exploration for natural gas and oil. They're basically like these, it's like the Nazca lines in Peru.
yeah.
They're just these lines. There's the whole entire landscape in the shale gas basins of northeastern BC and Alberta are just like sliced up by seismic lines over decades and decades of natural gas exploration. So it's one of the factors that the scientists have identified, that the wolves have adapted to those, and they're using them to efficiently travel quickly into areas. They the seismic lines, they crisscross each other, so the wolves can actually sort of like grid hunt areas. You go that way, I'll go this way, we'll go up here. Tomorrow morning
Jeez.
we'll meet over here. And it's like you basically, as fast as you can travel up a seismic line, if you cut a caribou track that crossed it, then you go north and then you go east, and you go, well, the caribou didn't cross the eastern cut line, I'll go down the other side, and it never crossed there. You talk to your buddy in the morning saying, yeah, he didn't go south. Bingo. He's somewhere inside this area bounded by these four seismic lines. So when they go and they hunt them. So, it's sort of theoretical, but most people working in that area have believe that the seismic lines have made the hunting efficiency of wolves, finding moose and finding caribou, much better. Like,
Well,
it's
that
just,
would make sense. I mean, they're unbelievably smart, and if you really look at it, most animals, um, I probably shouldn't use this term, but are lazy to an extent. As a path of least resistance,
yep,
and if
they
they
got to
can
save
get
energy.
around, yeah, yeah. I mean, if they can get around a lot easier by using those lines, then why the heck not?
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
So yeah, I mean, so part of the restoration work there is there's scientists that are going in, and they're like digging these seismic lines up, and they're like literally, like an excavator will dig up a little black spruce tree and plunk it down in the middle of the seismic line and knock some trees over, just kind of like to mess it up, so that it's just not this easy route to travel. It's like there's obstacles, and it's essentially slowing the wolves down and reducing their efficiency of hunting. The jury's still out scientifically a little bit on this, whether that's actually helping, but they are actually doing it and monitoring what's going on with that. So, that's a little example, but yeah, the anti wolf control crowd, or the pro wolf save the wolf crowd, or whatever, that's pretty strong here in British Columbia, and they tend to just create the narrative around, it's 1885 and the province of British Columbia and Alberta is just willy-nilly killing wolves because they still hate them and they're making them a scapegoat. Where there's a massive body of scientific literature out there now that says, like, hey man, this wolf control program, coupled with the maternal penning project in some areas of the province, is being coupled with moose density reduction, where there's a lot of moose. They have a cow harvesting hunting season, and hunters are drastically reducing the moose, which is having an impact on the wolves, which is helping the caribou out. So all of those things together, including the wolf control, there is an undeniable body of scientific literature out there that, in my opinion, beyond a reasonable doubt, proves that wolf control is helping to recover the endangered caribou.
Hmm.
But
Well, I'm glad to
don't,
hear that.
don't
I'm not
donate
surprised.
donate now and we'll save the wolf crowd does not agree with that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not surprised at all to hear that, because I mean, I personally believe that. Um,
The
but
wolf control in the areas that they do it, I think there's 35 or 40 zones, caribou recovery zones for the southern herds, and I think it's like 5 that they actually do wolf control in. So part of the narrative is like, geez, if you're not from British Columbia, you think that BC is just doing this over the whole entire province. It's not. It's very selected areas where they know that wolf predation is the limiting factor. It's intensive. So
hmm,
biologists go in earlier in the fall and they capture wolves and they put radio collars on them, and then they release them, and come January, February, they go find those wolves, they find the pack, and they shoot the whole works of them. So they go
interesting.
for 100% pack removal. Like I said, they're targeting 80% removal in a geographic area of the wolf pack on an annual basis. And I think the last summary report that I read from 2 winters ago, they were achieving 78.8% removal. And in some
Wow.
of the zones, they were seeing 100% recovery of the wolf population in 12 months, even with an 80% removal.
Wow. 100% in 1 year.
Yep. So they might go into an area and remove like 60 wolves and then go back next year and there's 60
60
more
more.
there.
Yeah.
Yep.
And is that a situation where other packs have moved in and
It it's partly that,
like a what do they call that, a
that's
power
part of
vacuum?
yeah, it's just sort of it's a dynamic that they know well with coyotes. If you get intensive removal, it's sort of like, oh man, they just, the more you shoot, the more there are. And part of that, like we know from different research and stuff, is just the infilling of vacant territory, drawing others in. But regardless, what you're doing is you're drawing wolves into an area where you're trying to keep caribou from disappearing off the face of the planet. So whether they're repopulating just because of natural growth or immigration into a vacant territory, they're just removing them just year
So
after year after year.
so how did all of this, the problems that you're seeing with wolves and your caribou species, you know, depreciating in certain areas, and possibly some other species of animals, how did that play into giving wolves to Colorado?
Right, yeah, that's the crux of this conversation. So when Colorado needed to basically go source wolves, after the proposition passed, it became law, became a mandate of the Colorado Parks and Wildlife. They sourced the first group from Oregon and they released them, and then they found out afterwards that they were known like cattle killing wolves, some of them in Oregon. So people are like, what the hell? And they started killing a few cows in Oregon right out of the gate. Then the next year they said, okay, we've got to X number of year, like that's the plan. They were going to get them from the Colville Confederated Tribes out of Washington, Idaho area. Then the tribes backed out. They said, no, we're hearing from our nation tribes in Colorado that they're not happy about the introduction, so they withdrew their offer to provide wolves out of the tribes area, that like the lands that they manage in Idaho and Washington. Then they ended up cutting a deal with Colorado, cut a deal with British Columbia, and it was basically like, look, we're gonna go up and kill them anyways. So rather than a gun, the biologists just found the Judas Wolf pack. There's the pack. They just kept flying until they were net gunned them, and then they started transporting them out and quarantining and testing, and then there was the whole big sort of covert action before the election, or before Trump administration took office, that they got those wolves out of British Columbia and into Colorado and released literally like days before President Trump took office. So
So I'm actually hearing too that the way that they brought the wolves in, because they're considered an endangered species in Colorado, um, there is a group that is planning on suing Colorado Parks and Wildlife and British Columbia. I don't know which department in BC or whatever, that they're planning on suing them because they transported an endangered species across uh, country lines. And actually, somebody had sent me a um, a letter from the see if I can find it. It sent me a letter from the lawyer where they are actually apparently suing the BC government over this situation too. Um,
yeah, that's an interesting one. I haven't heard of that. They're not endangered in British Columbia. They're they have no conservation concern, threatened status, nothing on them. They're ranked as secure, and their populations are doing quite well across every corner of the province. They're showing up in places where they haven't been for, a long time. So they're not a conservation concern, here. So they weren't really transporting an endangered species classified as that. So from the hunting world,
sure.
that if the hunters that go to Pakistan and pay for those Markhor permits, they're an endangered species under CITES. They can hunt them to have the trophy experience of saying, I got the Pakistan Markhor. But from what I understand, they cannot bring that trophy back into the States because it is an endangered species identified as under CITES. They can hunt them because the Pakistan government allows it. Same with polar bears. Like a U.S. hunter can come to the Arctic in Canada, hunt a polar bear, but he can't take it back. They're not endangered in Canada, but they're classified as vulnerable, I believe, by the U.S. federal government, Fish and Wildlife Service, so they can't be imported back in. So that's kind of an interesting one because they're not endangered here, but the polar bear, the U.S. says they're endangered, Canada says they're not, but they have an import ban on them. So, man, I wouldn't want to guess how that's gonna unfold. From what I understand, once they land in Colorado, they fall under whatever the classification the state has and the federal government has on them, because it's like it's their wolves now. They're yours. You get to classify them however you want. And that's been explained to me, and it's a little bit complicated federally, state level, and in Colorado as well. But yeah, I don't know that one. I kind of think like suing out of the country, a foreign government's probably not going to
Yeah,
go anywhere.
I don't know how that's going to work. um, but maybe just part of it is they just want to say, hey, stop screwing with us. I don't know.
Yeah. It.
I'll have to send you this letter. It's like a 4-page letter.
Okay. Okay.
You might be interested in reading it at some point.
I mean, it
Um,
kind of sounds like one of those things where lawyers do, and they send letters to kind of like it's saber rattling to kind of get you to, you know, look. I don't want to get caught up in all of this. It's not worth the headache. The From what I understand, the way the BC government looked at it is it's a government to government relationship. They respected that it was a legal mandate of the Colorado state government, and they didn't want to place, um, I guess, like bias or make, um, sort of a judgment against an autonomous state from making a decision. It's like they asked us for wolves. We respect
I
how
will
you arrived
oblige.
at
We're
that.
trying to get rid of them anyway.
And yeah, and here you go. And that's kind of, the whole way that, nations and states and stuff respect how they do it. Obviously in some cases, like, they cross the line and, like, look, man, you can't treat people like that, like the human rights things and
Yeah,
and those sorts of things, and countries say, like, no, no, we're not gonna help you out anymore because of these violations of you know UN human rights or
right.
whatever over there. Africa is the whole same way, right? Like this whole trophy ban, import ban thing, all of these sorts of things, going like, hey, they're a sovereign nation. Get your values out of their wildlife management, and they get to decide what they want to do with
Yeah,
their wildlife, how many, and how they want to make revenue off of that. And you need to respect African
yeah.
sovereignty. So
As a side point, I'm actually dealing with that currently as we speak. My grandfather had gone over to Africa, and he got an elephant and a lion and all that kind of stuff, and he is leaving it to my brother and I. Well, he's from a different state, and transporting it over state lines, and we've got the ivory and all that kind of stuff. It's like,
gotcha,
holy
gotcha.
cow, what a mess.
Wow. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
No, that I could see that being a challenge. So,
yeah.
but
So
good luck. I mean, it would be an amazing thing to have, a memory of that in your
yeah,
guys' possession. So,
yeah. So how did the cross border collaboration work? Did Colorado pay BC for the wolves, or did they just say, "Oh, here you go, you can
no,
have them
no,
as a
they
gift that keeps on
they
giving"?
they paid him. If I remember right, it was like $15,000 a wolf, so it was about 350,000, somewhere's in that range, for like whatever number that we're
I
taking
think it was
down.
15.
Yeah,
Did
yeah.
they have to pay for
So
the one that died? That apparently, I think it died in BC.
it did. Yeah, one of the wolves that they captured, I think, probably when it was like sedated, they they're testing the animals, blood work, all this kind of stuff, looking for their fitness. From from my understanding of it, I think the vets realized that there was something wrong with the one wolf, like as far as like I had understood it, it's something to do with an organ, like a disease or an organ disorder or something. Like it was not a a fit animal, and it was euthanized while it was under
Oh,
anesthetic.
okay.
So that one never made it out of the province. It was probably
S-
wouldn't have survived in the wild anyways. But the ones that they did transport down were all healthy
Yeah.
animals that would have been screened.
So speaking of disease, I can't remember for the life of me what the name of that disease is. I wanted to ask you about. Um, Apparently, it's transferred in their fecal matter or something like that. Um,
Yeah, it's a fluke. It's a parasite.
ah,
This is a here. Let me just grab this. So I was just reading about it this winter. So this book was written by a scientist at MacEwan University in Alberta called Fur, Fleas, and Flukes. And I think the first chapter is about this predator-prey dynamics that wolves and their prey have. And it's a there we go. There's the first chapter.
Ah, there we go.
Wolves and worms. So it's a parasite that the wolves carry. It's a tapeworm. It doesn't it doesn't affect them so much. Like it doesn't kill them or whatever. They they pass the tapeworm pieces out by through their fecal matter. Then through the whole process, moose end up ingesting these tapeworms, and then they get into the lungs of moose or elk, and then the tapeworm forms a cyst, and these cysts start to grow and get quite large. So the more of them that gets into the moose or the elk's lungs, they literally start to reduce the volume of the lungs, because you've got these big
That makes sense.
golf balls and baseball size things taking up space. So then somewhere along the lines, the wolf pack's traveling along, there's two moose, and they start to put the run on them, and one just doesn't have the cardiovascular fitness to go, and they eventually it tires, it just not getting enough oxygen, and then the wolves can get a hold of it and bring it down. So it's this fascinating relationship between, you know wolves are actually like infecting the prey on the landscape to make them a little bit more vulnerable and less risky to kill something as big as a moose or an elk. So
How prevalent
yeah,
is this?
I I don't know. Probably like everything in nature, it probably varies by, wolf population. Its ability to get into animals probably depends on their density. If you go into the far north, there's a lot of moose, but they're spread out over such a vast area. Maybe the prevalence in the moose is not quite as high because there's a lower probability of a moose coming in contact with, an infected wolf poop.
Hmm.
Somewhere else where your densities are, a bit higher, especially in elk wolf systems, then I would probably make a logical guess that the prevalence rate of that parasite in the elk would be higher because of, animal to animal transmission, and you know the more contact that wolves and elk have in crisscrossing where each other's living. So
Hmm. And is it transmissible to people?
not that I know of.
Okay.
I don't think so. It's kind of the
Hmm.
interesting. This is a great book. You get the EBGBs when you're a hunter and you eat venison
Yeah.
about all the stuff that's out there. But one of the common things is about parasites is they've evolved over tens of thousands or millions of years to be very host specific,
Hmm.
and so there's a lot more stuff out there that's affecting predators or their prey or both or whatever. That's just the parasite itself just doesn't want to have anything to do with us. Then there's a few like the trichinosis species and stuff where it's went, yeah, we'll take anybody.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I had heard that come up in the conversation about bringing wolves to Colorado. It's got its own naturally recovering low density of wolves now, where you're going to be bringing wolves with this parasite, and then it starts to contaminate the landscape more. I I think it's a question. I don't know if it's one of the things that they tested for. I would assume biologists and veterinarians are smart enough that one of the things they probably did, and I could find out because I could behind the scenes, I know some of the people that are involved in it. They help me out with information, but they're not allowed to say things. So I would have to assume that the workup done on an animal to translocate it is something as well known as this in wolves, that they were probably given parasitic medication, and that that would have, they just would have cleared it out of their system, just like, you know, the tube thing that they put in the horses, and you give it like the cocking gun, and you give it a squirt, or you give a pill to your dog. It's a one-time flush of any parasites in the gut system out. And then like with your dog, it could, like, literally 6 months later, you know, you'd have to do it again. So to me, it would logically make sense when an animal's being moved outside of jurisdictions that treating for parasites would be just a standard thing that would be
Right.
done.
So how does that whole uh, reintroduction with Colorado, um, how does that differ from what happened in Yellowstone?
Well, the wolves in Yellowstone came out of Alberta. I think that was 15 or something, you know, something about the same amount. So yeah, they were moved into that ecosystem. They had been extirpated from there. You know, I think one of the differences was is they were putting them into a national park, and for quite a while when their numbers were low, they could sort of make do inside the national park. But you know, as their populations grew and they started to expand, and different packs have got to start pushing out and finding territories, then of course they're pushing outside the national park. They're pushing into areas where folks want to hunt, where there's cattle ranching operations. I mean, they have the same issue with the bison, right, that leave the national park. So you know, it's a bit different in the sense that at least the place they dropped them off to start out with wasn't right smack in the middle of ranching country, rural folks, and public lands and state lands that, you know, you like to hunt on and whatnot.
Right.
So that immediately out of the gate just like lit a whole bunch of folks up, because they're immediately, you know, seeing the consequences within months of the reintroduction. Yellowstone, like, it took, you know, from what I understand, decades for that initial seed pack of wolves to then start, you know, expanding enough where the neighboring states are sort of like, okay, we kind of, if they leave the park, we want to do some management on our side of the park boundary. So,
Yeah.
you know,
Well, and
ideal
that
world,
that was kind
Yellowstone would have
of
been so large, you could have dumped 15 wolves into it and they had no reason to ever leave. But 15 turns into 30, turns into 75 or whatever. Yeah, Yellowstone gets pretty small pretty fast.
well, and that was kind of my point behind asking the question, because one of the biggest issues that we have is, and this is where we'll kind of tie it all together, right? Is there's a lot more people on the landscape than there was way back in, indigenous times, right? So one of the biggest arguments is, well, we could just leave them alone and they'll, the animals will manage themselves, right? But there weren't as many people that were going to have human wildlife conflicts. And you can say as much as you want about how they didn't have conflicts like we do now, with cattle and and pets and stuff like that. Sure, I'll give you that. We don't have
They
historically any issues
they might
that
have been
way.
dealing with more serious issues where it was
Yeah.
actually they
My
were the
kids.
ones that were
Yeah.
they were prey.
Yeah.
Especially you go back into the Pleistocene area and you had all those, you know, short-faced bears
Yeah.
and all that kind of stuff, the saber-toothed cats and whatnot. It's like, yeah, people were
Yeah.
you're as good as an elk there, buddy.
So we didn't have as many people on the landscape. So
Certainly a factor.
it has to be. And then you you had a much more abundance of prey species for the animals, right? Um, the interaction between people, as much as they don't want to say it, the indigenous, and from almost all of the indigenous natives that I've spoken to, read about, they all managed predator species from what I've seen. Um, so they had management of the predators, not as many people that were interacting with the predators. They didn't have cars for traveling and all that kind of stuff. They didn't have defined yards and houses in the middle of all these places. They had tight knit urban, if you call it that, urban areas with their teepees, you know. Um, and all of this combined is vastly different than what we're seeing with the reintroduction of any species uh, in modern times, right?
Yeah, I mean, I would
And
100% agree with you, Aaron. Like that's, you know, even to add to that, the mobility of people. We're a culture that just sort of, like you said, this is our yard, draw a square. I'm going to live and die here on this plot of land. But if you had to live off the land, people were much more nomadic and mobile.
mhm,
So even if folks moved into a valley, say traditionally we're going to hunt here until we can get like 10 elk, but then we're going to batch everything up and we've got to get way the heck over there by this month. And we know that if we get in now in September and we're out, then the wolves move in when the other animals move in, but we're gone. We're out of here, right? Where if you own a ranch in that valley and you're there 12 months a year and that's your fence line, even if a predator only rolls in for the winter months, because that's where the elk winter or whatever, you're right in there, right in their path. Where
yeah,
I think avoidance might have been part of the strategy with Indigenous people, especially in the interior, where they did have to move around by season to follow the resources.
yeah, exactly. And it's kind of reminiscent with what we're experiencing over here with the grizzlies. And I'm assuming is probably similar in your guys' area as well, where grizzlies are coming into areas where humans live. We had a lady that was killed in Ovando, Montana,
Mm,
not too long ago, where she was drug out of a tent in town or right outside of town.
geez.
Um, and it's becoming a lot more prevalent. Actually, I just read earlier today about a guy that was killed by a black bear off of his front porch, and that was in Arizona. And so these human wildlife conflicts are more concerning to me. It's not that I'm anti anything, because I'm really not. I think they're beautiful. I think they have a place, but it in my mind it all comes down to management, because if we don't manage these animals, then it's become it's going to become a situation where it's too late. You know,
Yeah. Yeah.
wolves are extremely hard to manage. They breed very quickly. They expand very fast. They're extremely smart. Traditional hunting methods that we can do is really really hard. Uh, so once it gets beyond the point where there's that tipping point, right? And once it gets beyond that point, we're, I think, in trouble.
Yeah. And I've talked about this before, and this is kind of a philosophy that I have. Part of this is we have to be able to talk to non-hunters about this and sort of like get them to understand where we're coming from, when we talk about these things. So we all know that, habitat is the basis of sustaining wildlife and biodiversity. We, I think everybody understands the idea that habitat shrinking, we can't make more animals with less habitat. Everybody likes to see wildlife on the landscape, but the landscape that we have and its productivity can only support so many animals. So in the cases of like large elk herds, white-tailed deer, hunting can be a management tool to keep them, relatively stable and commensurate with the productivity of the landscape. But whether it's predators or whether it's herds of elk, the other carrying capacity is society's tolerance to those animals. Everybody loves animals except for when they're causing $50,000 worth of crop damage every year, until they're killing X number of calves or sheep. Then you cross that tipping point, which is just people's tolerance. We see it in cities all over North America where 100 years ago, towns didn't have, the deer didn't live in town, they lived out.
Right.
And now we have these cities where, I remember in my community when that first started, it was a novelty. People would build troughs and put them out in their yards, and they'd go buy bird seed and deer feed and stuff. And like, it was a novelty. Then it was like, holy shit, man, they don't stop. Like I come out in the morning in my whatever magnetry or whatever thing or whatever, the bucket, like rubbed it up, and and
you no longer
ate the
can
cedar
keep flowers
bushes
in
up.
your flower bed.
And then all of a sudden everybody hates the deer, right? Where I always caution people, when you cross the social tipping line, humans are humans. And if you don't do something about it and acknowledging that people are fed up, people will take the matter into their own hands. And that's when you see the shoot, shovel, and shut up thing.
Mm-hmm.
Or worse, what you see is people that don't know what they're doing, as far as, let's just say, lethal removal of an animal, decide that they want to take matters into their own hands. It becomes poison. It becomes things like nail beds in planks on their porch because the bear likes to come up and get at the dog food.
Mm-hmm.
It can be something like you go to Cabela's and buy a trap. And we saw this a few years ago in the city of Calgary in Alberta. This bobcat that was living in town had a trap on its paw. And so everybody was blaming the trappers. And it was like, that's not a foothold trap. That is a body gripper for a marten. It would have been put in a tree in a box this way. A marten would have went in. It would have like snapped its neck and its back. Somebody that didn't know what they were doing went and bought that thing, opened it up like a mouse trap, set it in the yard, and the bobcat stuck his foot in it. And
it was just a conibear.
Yeah, just a body gripping conibear,
Yeah.
like a 140 or 160 or something like that. So that's always been my concern, is then like this vengeful killing, this retribution, this type of stuff, when people get pushed over the edge. That's when we see these horrible ways that animals are treated. I think we've probably all seen pictures of urban deer with a crossbow bolt through the neck or down through the side of the face. I am to the complete, and they're not broadheads. They're not, they're field points. So that, somebody went to the hardware store, don't need a license, bought a crossbow, stood on their deck when the deer was down eating the flowers, and said, well, you shoot it in the head. That's the most humane thing. And then this deer's got this arrow, down the side of the bone. Like, that's bad for wildlife. That's inhumane. No hunter, rancher, anybody wants to see animals treated like that. But if you push people to the point where they're suffering consequences, then some of those people start to take matters into their own hands, and it's very bad for wildlife what happens to them. And I lived in a different area one time where the guy was so sick of the deer coming into his yard, and this was in a rural area. He would, in his basement, he would slide his basement window open, and he'd put the barrel of the 22 out, and he'd go, and he'd just put a bullet through the stomach.
Oh wow!
And then weeks later, way off his land,
animal would die.
This deer would expire. He wasn't a hunter. Actually, didn't even have a hunting license or a firearms license. And anyways, his neighbor caught him, and he got charged or whatever. But this is what happens. And I think as hunters and as conservationists, we need to be able to talk to people about this. And it's easy to say people should just tolerate the wildlife. They were here first. They were coexist. But it doesn't matter whether it's a leopard in India that's killed one of your family members or your livestock and it jeopardizes your livelihood, or an elephant or an elk, and you're a rancher or a wolf, we can't let people go past that, because it doesn't matter whether it's the United States or in India or rural Africa, humans are humans. And at some point, they take matters into their own hands. And that's just bad for
Yeah.
wildlife, especially when we have the tools and the wherewithal to prevent a system from getting that far towards where people feel they have to take matters into their own hands.
Well, what would you say would be, well, what is your view of like successful conservation? Um, I know we had mentioned prior to that, you know, management, maybe we need to get away from the management talk. But I don't know how you actually could do that. I mean, it just seems blatantly obvious that that is what is needed. So, in your mind, what would be used, and what would be your idea of good conservation?
Well, that's a big question. I think, you know, good conservation or successful conservation is going to come down to what your defined objectives are. What is it that you're trying to do in a certain area? And are you reaching those objectives? To the context that we're talking about, reintroduction of wolves in Colorado, or just sort of to back up this idea about management, that was a conversation we were having sort of before we started recording, folks, is we're just kind of talking about having to talk to the non-hunting public with different language, with different ideas than what we talk amongst ourselves. You and I can talk like, oh, here's the numbers, there's this, that. Hunting is a management tool. We just bring the numbers down to here. Bang, yep, agree. You know, we're on the same page. But all of a sudden you start talking that way to the average non-hunting person, and they're like, whoa, you're going to do what? Hang on. Why do you have to manage them in the first place? Why can't you just leave them alone?
Mm-hmm.
So, so I think, you know, the days of wildlife managers who are hunters working with hunters on these concepts on the landscape, our way of communicating with each other, we were eye to eye. All of a sudden, we've reached an era where people with a lot of interest in wildlife and wildlife welfare and the sustainability of wildlife for non-hunting reasons want into the program. So now they get to have a say because it's a public resource. And as hunters or as wildlife managers, we need to be able to talk to these folks differently. So, what would good conservation look like? I think we need to shift the dialogue from not the what to the why, or what are we trying to accomplish? How are we going to accomplish management, predator management, control, reducing elk herd numbers? That's like a how. How we get, but we got to back up with folks and say, what do we want what do we want on the landscape here?
Yeah.
And everybody's just got to have a conversation of like, what's your vision for Colorado? What's your vision for this county in Colorado? Well, it's like this and it's that. And then the rancher would be like, I just want to be able to do this. And people are like, no, I get it. Like, that's, you know, that's admirable. I mean, wow, 6 generations, like that's pretty cool. Like, I mean, you care about your sheep, right? I get it. You know, you're out there in the night trying to keep a newborn lamb warm when it's blizzarding out and stuff. Like, I respect that. I want to be able to, you know, see a wolf or go out and hear him howl, and somebody's out like, well, you know, like I like trapping and my grandfather taught me how, and I can get $400 for a wolf pelt or whatever. And I don't want to kill them all. I just want to carry on that lifestyle and that tradition. Everybody has to, like, I think, decide collectively, what do we want this landscape to look like? And at some point, I think in a process like that, you're going to reach a point in the conversation where you're going to have to explore options like not exceeding that social capacity. I think people are going to get that because they're going to have seen that in the real world. Then you're going, well, we could just let nature take care of itself. And maybe you're going to have, you know, 50 out of the 100 wolves that are now in the States actually go off and curl up under a tree and die of poisoning because people are so fed up. Hey, we don't want that. Well, can you see we need to maybe keep them around these numbers so that the ranch, yeah, we could see that. Well, probably the most humane way to prevent suffering of wolves from people taking matters into their own hands is a bullet. And
Yeah.
they might be like, okay, like, don't like it, but we can kind of understand that that helps us all achieve this vision. And I think we can get there. We can get there in this day and age with the diversity of interests and values. If we start out with the, what do we want this landscape to look like? What is the landscape capable of having? Can we respect and find a middle ground of what everybody wants? How are we going to do it? What are the tools? And I think what I saw in Colorado was just like, all in favor? Yep. Bang. There you go. Nobody else got to say, it's not quite the vision that I was hoping for in this county and, you know,
Yeah.
around my family's, you know, multi-generational ranch. Too bad. You
Well,
got to live with it.
and from what I've been told, CPW actually was not in favor of it, which kind of baffled my mind because I thought the entire time that, CPW was kind of behind the whole thing,
Mm-hmm.
and from what I'm being told, they actually were not. Um,
It,
and
it makes sense.
yeah,
I mean, trained biologists and scientists and stuff, like they know, like, one, the cost. It's easy to say, it's easy to vote on, but they're probably sitting there going, holy smokes, over the next 15 years, like, this is a $40 million project. And if I don't get an extra $40 million in my budget, then I got to pull my annual elk inventory biologists off accounting elk and calf recruitment and, you know, and
yeah,
that sort of stuff. And it's like, you got to go, you know, catch a wolf and release it. Like, you know,
yeah,
so the realistically they're going like, yeah, I bet you folks don't know how much something like that would cost. And then I think they probably are all smart enough to go, you know, this is a pretty complex social thing. This is not releasing a couple of extra sheep on the mountain. This is a hot button, and this thing is could blow up in this state's face. Grizzly bears would do the same thing if they decided to reintroduce them into Washington, right? Like, I think wildlife managers know this is not, you know, reintroducing pandas and, you know, and
yeah,
stuff. Like, it's a pretty, it's a social issue is what we're
yeah,
talking about managing. And most biologists are like, man, you know what? Just let me go in a helicopter, an airplane, and count elk for the winter. And they don't want to deal with like the social side of trying to understand values and perceptions of wolves on the landscape and all this
right,
kind of stuff, because they're just going, holy shit. Um, so
yeah,
I really feel bad for Colorado in the sense that this came about in a way that should have probably been more than a decade of community conversations and plannings and people passing the pen around, drawing lines on a map of their communities and, you know, sorting those things out. Geez, the province next to me, Alberta, spent over 10 years on a wild turkey management plan, and they had to sort out everything to do with introducing and augmenting their population with extra birds that came out of my area in British Columbia. Like, it took 10 years. Like, where are they going to
wow,
go? How are you going to get landowner agreements in place? What about disease? What about quarantine? If they get off the landowner properties, that's going to caretake, you know, when you first introduce them and they start causing problem in a community 20 kilometers down the road, what's your plan? How are you going to address that? Like, all of those details had to be sorted out 10 years in advance. So I'm like, just imagine what it would take to get all the people on the landscape to agree on what, where, how many, how are you going to augment a naturally recovering wolf population. Maybe the people would have come to the agreement going like, no, let's just
Well,
put
that
some radio
seems like
collars on the
a
ones we
somewhat
got.
reasonable approach. I mean, but well, Mark, where can people find you and follow the work that you guys are doing over at Blood Origins?
Yeah, so Instagram is our main social media platform. So we're Blood Origins Canada, Blood Origins _ Canada. Of course, the global parent charity, Blood Origins. They're easy to find. We now have the Origins Foundation, which is a new
On TikTok.
nonprofit
Yep.
foundation. Yeah, you'll find Blood Origins and the foundation on TikTok as well. The Hunter Conservationist podcast is our flagship podcast in Canada, and that's on all the major podcast platforms. And I think I have five different podcast shows of different topics and genres that are published underneath of that channel title, the Hunter Conservationist Podcast. So
awesome.
Reach out
do
to
you
me
have
on
any,
Instagram. I'd love to hear from folks.
Do you have any final thoughts?
Yeah, I think the final thought is actually how this whole thing started with us. Comes back to this central issue of the BC wolves are now showing up dead in Colorado. And so I'm seeing a number of people saying, hey, wolf advocates, how do you feel now that you took these wolves, right? And, took them away from their home and their wilderness areas, and now they're dying. Like how compassionate and coexistence is that? And part of, what I've reached out is saying, we need to figure out how to talk to the public in Colorado about this, because if they had not been moved to Colorado, they would have been dead in January. Those wolves were marked to be killed. And if they said, if we're going to be flying, it's just as easy to give you these ones, because we just switch out a gun for a net gun, and then they're yours in a box. So the fact that some of them have died, if the pro-wolf advocates are probably like, well, if 3 out of 15 die or 4 out of 15 die, 100% of them were earmarked to be killed in January. So at least they had a second chance on life. I think that's an important part of this conversation to the community that we want to talk to say this ramming this idea down everybody's throat in a matter of a few years is not turning out to be the best thing for people, for wildlife, for the wolves themselves. But we have to figure out how to address that part of it, to say they're kind of getting a second lease on life by being transported. I think the conversation has to be putting wolves on the ground, regardless of where they come from. The way you arrived at that decision in Colorado just doesn't take everybody into consideration. And maybe you need to pump the brakes and go back to a community grassroots planning process. So that'd be my final thoughts. Was just
okay. Yeah,
it's funny because the Save the Wolf group here in British Columbia knew these wolves were going to be killed in the wolf call. They knew they were going to be sent to Colorado, but they were adamantly opposed to them being captured and sent to Colorado.
Wow.
So
make that make sense.
Yeah, I was hoping you could, because I was sort of like, holy. For them, I think it was more like, well, you shouldn't be killing them in the first place. And they're our wolves and we want to enjoy them and they're part of the ecosystems where they came from. But the reality is, great, I understand that way of looking at it, but they were going to be killed. So it's funny that a group said, well, if you're not going to stop the wolf call, then, try to move as many of them to new homes as you can. But that wasn't the sentiment here. So
yeah. Well, thank you, Mark. I really appreciate it.
It's been awesome, Aaron. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Anytime.
You know your stuff. You're connected.
Oh, thank you. Wolves from British Columbia chasing ghosts of an ecosystem long gone in Colorado. It's a powerful image, but it's more than that. It's a question of balance, of truth, of what it means to manage nature instead of just watching it unravel. Huge thanks to Mark Hall for lending his voice and his perspective today. If there's one thing I hope you take away from this episode, It's that conservation isn't about choosing sides. It's about choosing to listen to science, to history, to people who've lived with wildlife every single day. If this episode challenged your views or maybe even shifted them, do us a favor. Share it, rate it, send it to a friend, and most of all, keep asking questions. You can follow Mark and his team at bloodorigins_Canada. They're doing some of the best myth-busting work when it comes to conservation in the world today, in my opinion. Until next time, this is the Primitive Republic Podcast. I'm Aaron Schmaus. Stay wild, stay thoughtful, and stay human. Cool.